Today I'm doing an informative speech on a favorite hobby of mine known as Dungeons & Dragons. Now, Dungeons & Dragons has gotten a bad rep from time to time. People have gone to schools, they've said that Dungeons & Dragons has forced me to do this and that, but all Dungeons & Dragons really is a fantasy game based off of your imagination and the friends that you work with and coming together to create a fantasy setting with a story, plot, and characters and a twist. It's just like a book, but it's more like real life. Well, more like real life in the sense that real life people actually do it instead of reading a book. There's three aspects to D&D. The first aspect is your Dungeon Master. The second aspect is your players. And the third aspect is your story. Each one of these work hand in hand to be able to make out what comes together to become the game and my hobby, Dungeons & Dragons. Now, the first aspect, which is your Dungeon Master, is your storyteller. He's like the person that writes the book, comes together, puts the story together, and makes everybody run through his world. Now, the Dungeon Master is going to use the Dungeon Master Guide to run through his rule set so that he can follow a guideline so everybody understands how the game is supposed to operate and follows the same set of rules. Just like playing a board game, you know, you want to follow the same rules as everybody else. You don't want to change in the middle of the game. Now, the Dungeon Master will also utilize the Monster Manual, which will come up with his creatures and things of that nature for your encounters, the things that you see while you're traveling, you know, your deer, anything from deer to dragons you can find in this book. Now, the second aspect of Dungeons & Dragons is going to be your characters, which utilize your player's handbook and an array of any other books that are on the shelves. They probably make 40 per edition of this game in all reality. Now the players, what they'll do is they'll make a character based off of a fantasy and a story that they want to work through and what they feel is appropriate for their mindset. So if somebody wants to be a sneaky person, go through back doors, hide, pickpockets, they'll play a rogue. If somebody wants to play a healer that supports everybody, brings people up, leads them into battle, leads them into, you know, inspiration, they'll play a healer, and so on and such forth. You'll find your warrior classes, you'll find everything that you would normally see in a real-life fantasy setting in this game you can create based on what you feel is necessary. Now the third part, and what I feel is the most important part of Dungeons & Dragons, is your story. Now your story is what brings everything together. You have your Dungeon Master who's going to be telling the story, and your characters are playing the story. You make the characters to roll with what the Dungeon Master has designed. The Dungeon Master designs the story around what the characters can do and what they should be doing so that they have a goal and an orientation, and they may use something like a world. In this particular case, I used, for example, Forgotten Realms, which is a fantasy world created by Wizards of the Coast for the sole purpose of players with their Dungeon Masters and their players coming together and going through the fantasy settings, seeing the dragons, seeing the trolls, seeing everything that they want, and knowing exactly where they are. It gives you your maps, your cities, layouts, everything that you would consider as part of the game if you were to think of a fantasy city, a fantasy world, and a fantasy setting. So everything that we bring together here all comes into the conclusion of what Dungeons & Dragons really is. And what Dungeons & Dragons really is a fantasy setting built in your imagination, designed by players, or by the Dungeon Master, but worked with the players, to create an interesting and epic environment, something that everybody can get into, enjoy, and have fun. But all in all, what it really comes down to is a bunch of people getting together, having a good time, having a few sodas, ordering a pizza, taking the time out of their day to enjoy each other's company in a setting that everybody can kind of mold into their own mind. So I hope this gives you guys an understanding of one of the hobbies that I really enjoy, which is Dungeons & Dragons. And in the future, maybe you too will decide to try out this interesting hobby and not just throw it along the wayside based off of rumors.